In the Homeric epic The Odyssey, the protagonist Odysseus is called the man of many devices, which in modern terms means he lies. Like, a lot. But one specific lie, his so-called second Cretan lie, is of particular interest. In Book 14, the goddess Athena has disguised Odysseus as a beggar, and he is in the home of his loyal pig herder. There, to maintain his disguise, he tells him a made-up story about his past as an adventurer and a pirate. And while this is presented as a wholly fictitious life story, some scholars think much of it rings true, and that it has a striking resemblance to what we know of some of the Sea Peoples, especially the group known as the Sherden. So, was Odysseus one of the Sea Peoples? And is his Cretan lie really so fictitious? Let's dig in. Now, a few quick caveats before we dive into this. First, much of the research on this subject is done by the scholar Jeffrey Emmanuel. We are largely following his work here, so if you're interested in a deeper dive, we would encourage you to check out his work, which we have cited in the description below. Secondly, this is not a video about the historicity of either the Iliad or the Odyssey. Whether these works preserve Bronze Age stories and traditions is an interesting question, but it's beyond our scope for today. We are focused on just a few lines in Book 14 of the Odyssey and whether these lines may record a Bronze Age memory of the Sea Peoples phenomenon. So what is the Cretan lie exactly? More specifically, what is Odysseus' second Cretan lie? Within the narrative of the story, Odysseus has just been brought to his home of Ithaca by the ships of King Alcinous, king of Phaeacia, which some identify with the island of Corfu. Odysseus encounters the goddess Athena in disguise and lies to her about his origin, saying he's from Crete. The first Cretan lie. Athena disguises Odysseus as a beggar and takes him to his loyal swineherd Eumaeus. It is in the house of Eumaeus that Odysseus receives the man's hospitality and is told about the suitors to his wife Penelope, who believe Odysseus is dead. Odysseus then tells his second Cretan lie, and here we'll highlight a few of the most relevant details. Odysseus says he is the son of a wealthy man from Crete. He says his mother was a concubine, a woman bought by his father. He claims that when his father died, his true-born brother split his father's wealth and he was left to make his own fortune. He states he never really took to farming, but instead sailing and warfare were more to his taste. For different men take joy in different works. Odysseus says that before the Trojan War, he, or his Cretan alter ego, had led 9 seaborne raids against foreign lands and returned with captured loot. He grew wealthy doing this until the Trojan War. Following the Trojan War, he says he was with his family for a brief time before he felt compelled to go to Egypt. He outfitted 9 ships, and after a week-long period of preparation, he set sail for Egypt, reaching it in 5 days. He moored his curved ships in the delta and sent out scouts to find a target to raid. But his men grew impatient, and they began looting the area, taking the women and the children. But their attack drew the attention of the Egyptian army, and Odysseus' men's courage faltered. Some were killed, others were taken by Egypt. Odysseus claims he was taken captive by the king and kept alive there for 7 years, where he became quite wealthy. In the 8th year, a Phoenician lured him into an ill-fated expedition where their ship was caught in a storm, and Odysseus claims he was adrift at sea. Eventually he comes to Ithaca, but that part of the lie is not particularly relevant to us at this point. So what do we make of this, other than maybe a creative fiction or just a good adventure story? Well, there are a lot of elements of this story that ring true, elements that may reflect late Bronze Age realities. First is the claim that Odysseus led 9 raids against foreign territories. This is certainly historically plausible, and the evidence for it comes in a number of forms. First is the direct written evidence. In a 14th century letter between a king on Cyprus to the pharaoh, the king is responding to accusations that Cypriot ships had raided Egypt by counterclaiming that he himself is subject to seasonal raids by men from Lucca, that is southwestern Anatolia. Similarly, a Hittite king, perhaps Arnuwanda I, composed what we know as the Indictment of Maduwada. This text, and what we have is likely only a draft form, but it recounts the misadventures of several warlords, including Atarsia, who was an Ahiyawan warlord, with Ahiyawa being almost certainly the Hittite term for the Mycenaean world. In the letter, Maduwata is quoted as stating he raided Cyprus along with Atarsia and another king in western Anatolia, even saying he raided it often. So while these references are to raiding on Cyprus specifically, we can reasonably extrapolate that these kinds of raids were done elsewhere, not exclusively on Cyprus. Notably too, Aegean soldiers are explicitly involved. Further evidence from Egypt comes from the so-called Tanis II rhetorical stela dated to the reign of Ramses the Great. In it, he refers to the Sherden, a group that later are associated with the Sea Peoples, and says they sailed into Egypt on warships, but they were taken captive into Egypt. Additionally, archaeological survey has identified in places like Crete a shift in settlement patterns around 1200 BC to fortified hilltop settlements, often overlooking the sea. It's been argued that these could serve as places of refuge against raids, giving early warning of approaching ships. But they also may have served as fortified hideouts from which pirates and raiders may have operated out of and been safe from retaliation, not unlike what is described by Odysseus. Odysseus states that he outfitted 9 ships for a raid on Egypt, and that he reached Egypt after a 5-day voyage. Now there is some debate as to what kind of ships were in use in the decades around 1200 BC. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, the heroes are said to have had fleets of pentaconters, a kind of ship used in the Iron Age Aegean. However, there are indications these vessels date to as early as the late days of the Bronze Age. At Tragana near Pylos, a pyxis, that is a particular form of a small ceramic vessel, was found in a tomb and dated to the 12th century that depicts what is likely a pentaconter. A 13th century larnax, or small coffin, on Crete also likely depicts a pentaconter. So there's growing evidence that this kind of ship was in use late in the Bronze Age and continued to develop throughout the geometric and archaic periods. These kinds of ships were called pentaconters because they had roughly 50 oarsmen, and these numbers accord well with what we know from late Bronze Age textual sources. The so-called rower tablets from Pylos record 569 oarsmen, usually reconstructed to 600, and this would outfit 12 ships. Another tablet from Pylos mentions 30 rowers for 1 ship. So the 9 vessels Odysseus mentions is much more in line with what late Bronze Age city-states were able to field. And Odysseus' fleet may have had as many as 450 warriors. This may sound insignificant, but in a letter exchange between the kings of Ugarit, a coastal city in Syria, and the king of Cyprus, the king of Ugarit is warned that 7 enemy ships are headed toward him, and this is, in no uncertain terms, a significant threat. Another letter warns of 20 ships, and that Ugarit should hastily take precautions to protect themselves. While Helen may have launched 1,000 ships, that number seems wildly overinflated for the late Bronze Age, with the numbers in Odysseus' Lie being much more plausible. Another feature of the pentaconters is that they represented a shift in maritime warfare. These ships were not simply used as transport vessels, moving soldiers and cargo from point A to point B, but as actual warships. The Iron Age versions were outfitted with rams so ships could engage and sink other ships while sailing. And this innovation may actually be alluded to in the same Tanis stela referenced earlier. The term used for warship in the stela, it seems, was made up for this inscription. That is, the Egyptians used a new term for the phrase warships in the midst of the sea. Why this is not clear, but one hypothesis is that this was a new technology, a new type of ship, that the Egyptians had not encountered and so needed a new term to describe it, and of course wanted to boast about them overcoming even a novel threat. Even the amount of time to sail from Crete to Egypt is surprisingly plausible. Strabo records that sailing from Crete to Egypt took 4 days and nights. While Strabo of course postdates both the late Bronze Age and Homer by a fair bit, scholars believe Mycenaean merchants followed a known route from Crete to Egypt. And while many scholars assume Bronze Age mariners never sailed out of sight of land, this has been challenged in scholarship. In the tale Odysseus spins, his raiders were impetuous and were engaged by Egyptian soldiers, and some were killed with others captured. Odysseus claims he stayed for 7 years and grew wealthy. The 7 years and living in the 8th year may be an echo of the Near Eastern idiom where 7 represents a sense of completeness or fullness before something new is taken on. Whether the time here is meant as literal or figurative is immaterial. What Odysseus communicates is that while in Egypt, he was not tossed in a dungeon or put to work in the fields for the pharaoh, but instead was put to work where he was handsomely rewarded. This again is echoed in Egyptian inscriptional evidence related to the Sherden. The same Tanis inscription records the Sherden carried off to Egypt. At the Battle of Kadesh, Ramses the Great has Sherden operating as part of his bodyguard. Papyrus Anastasis 1 lists several hundred Sherden as part of the Egyptian army, suggesting they were well incorporated into the Egyptian military already, even as a contingent of foreign warriors. The Wilbur Papyrus, dated to the reign of Ramses V, records land registries in the Fayum and mentions 109 Sherden, as well as standard bearers of the Sherden and retainers of the Sherden. Several of the land plots are on par with those allotted to priests and other high officials in Egyptian society, attesting to the Sherden's status and wealth within Egyptian society. One final note is that Odysseus says his Cretan alter ego was the son of a concubine. Perhaps an odd detail to include, but this too we have textual evidence for. In Linear B tablets from Pylos, there are mentions of women from various locations: Lemnos, Miletus, Chios, and Asia, to name a few. These women are all listed as dependents of the palace, so what their role is not clear, but other references to captives or women taken as loot also appear, which may corroborate the Cretan lie of Mycenaean men taking captured women as concubines. So when we pull it all together, Odysseus' second Cretan lie, while within the narrative is a fabrication, it sounds a lot like late Bronze Age reality. The taking of women as captives, leading raiding parties to foreign lands, having small, agile fleets with raiding parties of a few hundred that, despite their modest size, posed a substantial threat to coastal settlements. And significantly, many of the historical corroborations are associated with the Sea Peoples, specifically with the Sherden of the Sea in Egyptian sources. Groups that became associated with the Sea Peoples, like the Sherden, raided coastal lands well before the times of Merneptah or Ramses III. They lived in lands that were foreign to them and fought as mercenaries there. They accrued wealth while serving foreign kings. Later sources even show Sherden living in Egypt, marrying Egyptian women, and otherwise integrating into Egyptian life, a key point of departure between the historical sources in the Odyssey. So as Jeffrey Emmanuel puts it, in the case of the Odyssey and its hero's second Cretan lie, the experiences of the central character find a remarkable analog in a very real and very specific group of sea raiders, the Sherden of the Sea, who set upon Egypt and their ships, likely many times over, around the same time Odysseus claims to have carried out his ill-fated raid. And I think this is significant for several reasons, beyond demonstrating possible Bronze Age realities in Homeric tradition. If the second Cretan lie is in fact a memory of the Bronze Age, maybe even a preserved oral tradition or account, it represents perhaps our only emic source from the Sea Peoples. Again, if we can take it as a credible witness to an ancient tradition, it may offer insight into who the Sea Peoples were. Odysseus' Cretan character was a disfavored younger son, forced to make his fortune because he was left with no inheritance. Yet he maintained his life of piracy and raiding even after he gained wealth to afford land. There are numerous lines of inquiry we could explore within this lie. And while it sounds authentic, as with so much in Homer, it remains an open question as to how much of it represents Iron Age realities as opposed to late Bronze Age ones. Is there, in fact, a historical memory preserved in this passage, or how much of it is in fact a lie? We may never know for sure, but I think there's enough here to force us to consider that Odysseus' lie may in fact not have been wholly fictitious. Maybe it was for Odysseus, but it sounds plausible for someone. And when we place this passage within the wider framework of the epic cycle, we know there were several Nostoi traditions, stories of the heroes of Troy trying, and in many cases failing, to return. Stories of many misadventures in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean before returning home safe and sound, or sometimes not either safe or sound, after the sack of Troy. Odysseus' lie, to me, leads me to ask how many heroes of the Trojan War sailed the Eastern Mediterranean in the waning days of the late Bronze Age, only to step out of myth and into history as the Sea Peoples.